Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today, a much requested video, we're going to take a look at landing the Airbus in low visibility conditions. This is a very exciting part of aviation. It captures a lot of people's imaginations and I can totally see why. It's a real testament to the abilities of the aircraft and the safety of the industry these days that we can do things such as land the Airbus in the thick fog that you can see beneath us now. It's a wonderful feeling to fly the aircraft in those conditions. It's incredibly satisfying. It's also incredibly challenging. There are lots and lots of things we have to check. Autolanding an Airbus is not as easy as just sitting there and letting it do it and relaxing. It is a matter of us having to be incredibly aware of what the aircraft is doing, what it's trying to achieve, and how serviceable it is. Is it working properly? Is it engaging the modes we expect it to? So a lot of today's video is going to be talking about how we set up the aircraft to fly an Autoland, and then we'll go and obviously fly one here in Lisbon, Portugal, where we've arrived after an very early morning flight out of Gatwick with our eager passengers, and we've, surprise surprise, found ourselves surrounded by fog on the ground when we get here. This is not too uncommon on coastal destinations. Luckily, Lisbon has a completely serviceable Cat 3 runway, so we're going to talk about that. So we'll have a look at the charts, we'll set up the airplane, and then we'll fly the approach. And by the end of this video, even if you're new to Autolands and the Airbus, you should have no trouble flying an Autoland yourselves. Now, this is of course a video that is not for any real-world use. I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but this is just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. It's also going to be applicable to whichever Airbus aircraft you're using, as long as it's capable of auto-landing. So if you're using the Low Vis and X Plane 11, because I don't think I've done an Autoland video with that yet, then this will work absolutely fine for that as well. This is pretty standard set of rules that we are following, just a few changes to limitations. So that will also work if you're using another Airbus that has the Autoland capability. I'm going to be using the Phoenix A320 for today's video, and let's get into the video. Just before we get started, I'd like to remind you about our partnership with Apex Gaming PCs, where we have some custom 320 Sim Pilot flight simulator computers. We have the Bus and the Manta. You can customize them on the website, and you can use the code 320 Sim Pilot to get a discount of 5%. You'll also be supporting the channel if you do buy one. Right, let's get on with the video. Here we are on the flight deck now. So this is a typical view on a day where you'll be using low visibility procedures. It's not uncommon to have clear skies above the fog layer. It just usually covers the last sort of couple of thousand feet above the ground. Now, of course, that's just my experience in Europe. You might have different experiences around the world, and I'm sure there's airfields where you get different sort of phenomena. I'm thinking, for example, of Iceland, Keflavik, where you can have quite a thick layer and quite a windy layer. But typically around Europe, Northern Europe especially, we just get this sort of thin-ish layer of cloud that sits right on the floor. What fog is it's when the temperature of the air has reached the dew point of the temperature as well. So we can actually, this is something forecasters will work hard on, is to predict it. So we'll see it in the weather forecasts. So we should have an idea before we set off that we may be encountering low visibility procedures when we arrive, in which case we will almost certainly carry extra fuel with us. As you can see, we've arrived with about 5.3 tons of fuel. That's a lot even for low visibility procedures, but you want extra with you for reasons we'll discuss in just a moment, aside from the obvious. So yeah, it's what I mean by the temperature reaching the dew point is that cold air can't hold as much moisture as warm air. So what you get is as the temperature drops, if the dew point or the humidity of the temperature doesn't reduce as well, if the air stays really humid, that temperature dropping can eventually mean that the water in it can no longer stay in it. It becomes saturated air, so it condenses. So all the water that was being absorbed by that warmer air, as the air temperature cools, it can no longer be absorbed and it condenses into water droplets in the air, and that's what gives us our clouds. What happens when it's foggy is this happens right above the ground. You'll see this if you're going for a walk late at night and the temperature's starting to drop. You might see it over fields where you'll have the same thing happen. The temperature will cool over the field and then the sort of mist or haze will appear just above the level of the ground. It's notable to happen in the evening, and in the morning it's less likely to occur in the middle of the day, of course, because that's the temperature will be coldest just before dawn. And likewise it will drop as the sun goes down again. So in those two situations, that's where we can see the fog appear, and there are other local weather phenomena that can cause it. So If we're reading a weather forecast and it doesn't predict any fog, but it says, oh, it might be misty, say 5 kilometers visibility in mist, and we can see the temperature and dew point has already got very close and the sun hasn't even set yet, or it's just about to, then we can start to get an idea that fog is a higher risk than normal, even if the forecast maybe didn't predict it, because of course forecasts can be written up to 12 hours in advance or even longer. So there are lots of different aspects to it. So today we have arrived, coastal area, not uncommon to find fog, and here we are. Airfield is completely fogged out, so we're going to set ourselves up for an approach. So things we're going to think about. We need to know that the airfield is capable of flying a low visibility approach and an autoland. So what we're looking for here is the minima that the airfield is capable of. On our chart, it's quite handy. We have the ILS for runway 02, that's going to be the runway in use, and we also have the Cat 2-3 ILS chart. So it's actually a separate chart. Not all airfields are like this, but this one is. So there we go. They have a normal ILS 530 minima with an RVR of 750 meters required. RVR is the runway visual range, and that is the measured range of how far along the runway you can see or how far the light will be visible. The reason we don't just use visibility when you get down to these numbers is RVR is more precise. So RVR becomes a very controlling thing, and we need to know the current RVRs in the airfield. So as you can see, we're going to fly a Cat 3B, which is the most or the best sort of autoland we can do, which goes down to an RVR of just 75 meters. A Cat 3A would be 200 meters, Cat 2 would be 300 meters. Now, there is a lot of theory that goes into autolanding in Airbus, and it's a big topic that we spend a lot of time studying. So I'm not going to be able to go into everything today. I'm sure I'll miss things out, and I apologize for that now, but there are so many different aspects to it. So it would just go on forever. It's a big topic, and it's amazing because it's only a difference of a few hundred meters in visibility, but it makes all the difference in the procedures. So RVR, runway visual range, becomes how we measure it. When we start talking about Cat 3B, Cat 3A and Cat 2 approaches, we're not really thinking about the cloud base anymore, because as you can see out the window, we are effectively going to land in this cloud. So it doesn't really matter how low it goes. You're landing in the cloud, so it's all about that runway visual range. The idea is, if the runway visual range is, for example, if we were doing a Cat 2 approach, if it was 300 meters on the ground and the airfield didn't have Cat 3 minima, let's pretend these weren't here, then we would need to have an RVR of 300 meters, which means the runway visual range would be 300 meters. And in that case, by the time we reach our minima, which is the lowest altitude we can continue down the glide slope towards the runway, so we're coming down here, and we need the RVR to be correct, and then we need the minima we're going to reach of right out of 100 feet. So 100 feet above the runway, as long as we've got 300 meters visibility, we should see the runway lights, even if we're still within the cloud. So the RVR is what becomes controlling. So we need to know a few things before we can begin this approach. Is the airfield capable of what we want to do? Well, I'm going to do a Cat 3B ILS today, and the airfield will actually broadcast on the ATIS, their weather information, that they are running low visibility procedures. There will be a separate section in the information pages as well, where they will discuss what the low visibility procedures are for this airfield. It will include things like protecting the runway glide slope, because you can't just go and land an airfield that's got low visibility, that's got fog, because if we look on this next chart, you'll see that there are the runway, and then we have all these different stop bars. So we can't land in fog if an aircraft is parked, for example, right next to the runway, because it could interfere. It's more applicable to the other end, because the localizer antenna is going to be down this end for the runway we're landing on 02. But basically, they can't have aircraft, or maybe trucks, maybe someone's cutting the grass. But if you're in low visibility procedures, they won't have that anywhere near the active runway, because they don't want it interfering with the localizer, and they don't want it interfering with the glide slope, which will be somewhere here as well, or either side. But yeah, it's going to be a case of making sure that those radio signals can't be interfered with by big aircraft or metal objects or anything like that getting in the way. So there's extra protection on those, because it's obviously completely crucial that they guide us very accurately down to the runway. So we're going to make sure that those are in force for our approach. We're also going to make sure that we are qualified. Pilots aren't automatically qualified for low visibility procedures. If you learn to fly the Airbus, you cannot just go and auto-land it until you've also passed your low visibility qualifications. That will vary country to country, but it will involve going into the simulator and practicing failures during auto-lands. Remember, training for flying aircraft is not about just flying them in the nice weather and everything working. It's about things going wrong and how you handle them. So a big part of being an airline pilot who can auto-land an aircraft is the training for when things go wrong during that auto-land. So that brings me on to my next point, which is the aircraft capable? Well, we need to check that the aircraft is qualified to do it. It's unusual, but there could be an issue with the aircraft, meaning that on the status page it would say Cat 3 single, or maybe Cat 2, or even Cat 1 only. So that is possible. So that would appear on the status page. You'd have probably had a failure, or in the tech log it would have given you the reason, such as an MEL that's been applied to this aircraft. In which case we probably wouldn't have set off with it, knowing that we were arriving in Lisbon in fog. But still, it maybe was unexpected. So anyway, you need to make sure the aircraft is capable. You can see we have actually got a failure here. This is not by design. This is something that's come up just as I loaded the sim today. Cabin temperature by pack only, but that doesn't affect our landing capability, fortunately. So we'll disregard that. Because as I say, we would know if it did. It would say the category 3 in op, whatever, on that screen there. Great. We need to know the weather at the airfield. So I know, because I've set it up, that Lisbon's running in, I think it's probably going to be about 150 meters visibility, but you need to check that. And as I said, they will report in fog the RVRs at 3 different points along the runway. So there's 3 measurements taken. So you're going to have the touchdown zone area, the midpoint, and the stop end. So what do we actually need? So bear with me. I'm going to try and get this put right. So landing Cat 3B ILS, you can see here RVR 75 meters. So that's all we need today, because we're going to do a Cat 3B, and this runway is capable. If we were doing a Cat 3A, for example, if the aircraft was broken and needed us to do a Cat 3A, couldn't do Cat 3B, then we would need RVR of 200 meters. Next point is we don't need 200 meters all the way along if we land Cat 3A, because as I said, the touchdown zone measurement needs to be this. This is talking about the touchdown zone. The midpoint measurement needs to be the 125 meters, which is the takeoff lowest we can do in the A320, 125 meters, or it needs to be the touchdown zone if that's lower. So if you're doing Cat 3B, it can be 75. So we need 75 meters for the touchdown zone, 75 meters for the midpoint for our Cat 3B. If we were doing a Cat 3A, we would need 200 meters for the touchdown, 125 for the midpoint, because it can't go lower than 125 unless your touchdown zone is lower. This is what I mean. It is going to get confusing. Don't worry too much about this. I'm going to breeze through this so we can get on and set up the aircraft. But we are going to check the weather very carefully. I can assure you your pilots are checking that very carefully. We can only fly the approach as long as the RVR stays above 75 meters. If we get down to just before 1,000 feet on this approach, where we want to be stable, and what's called the approach band as well, 1,000 feet above the runway, if we get down to that point and the RVR has gone below 75 meters, or whatever we require, then we will go around. We are not allowed to continue the approach below 1,000 feet if the RVR is not at your requirement. If you go below 1,000 feet, and then it goes below what you need, then you are allowed to continue, but you just can expect a high chance of a go around. That is a crucial rule. It's designed, I believe, to stop high-risk approaches or people trying when the odds are against them. So we need this minima to be applicable. So you're going to have a very clear idea about what you're looking for. As I said, 75 meters today for us. Very rare to go below 75 meters. That is incredibly thick fog. I don't know if I've ever seen actual RVRs of 75. Usually higher. Going below 200 is possible, again rare, and even 300 below that is rare. So Cat 2 is probably what you need most of the time, but still, 75, it's very thick fog. So we're going to make sure that weather is suitable. We're going to also make sure we have enough fuel. We've got 5 tons, so we've got plenty of fuel to stay in this hold, because of course it's highly likely you will be put in a hold whilst you wait to fly this approach. This is why we've arrived with extra fuel. The problem with fog is, as you saw, we can't have aircraft near the runway, we can't have aircraft close to each other on approach. They need more time on the runway after landing, because they're going to have to very carefully vacate the runway, and they also can't get them in the air very quickly, because of course they can't get them near to the runway until the other aircraft has vacated. So big spacing goes in, and very quickly delays build up, so you need to arrive with extra fuel to account for that. Another thing you need extra fuel for is the alternates. What is your plan B out of all of this? Where are we going to go if this doesn't work? What if we're in the hold here and the RVRs are reported at 100 meters, which means the only option we have is a Cat 3B ILS, and then our aircraft breaks and it goes to Cat 3 single? Do we have enough fuel to get somewhere with half decent weather? We are required at the planning stage to make sure we can. We need to be able to get to another alternate, or an alternate airfield that has a capability that we can land at with a capability above what they actually have. So we need a good very, very good set of alternates when you're flying an approach like this. So you're going to arrive with enough fuel to get somewhere with either better weather or better facilities, and weather that's considerably better than you need to land there. And that is crucial. So we're going to have enough fuel for that. because you need to be able to do that. What if we're sitting here and then suddenly a truck does drive into the ILS because the fog was too thick and they broke the antenna? What are you going to do? You need to be able to go somewhere else. You can't just rely on this all working because it's a lot of extra requirements. If it was clear skies and someone drove into the ILS antenna, well, fine, we'll go and fly a non-precision approach or even a visual, no problem at all. But in this condition, we have to make sure this is all working for us. Next, something to think about, downgrades. What can we do if we're flying this approach, we plan for our Cat 3B, and then the airplane brakes on approach? Now, below 1,000 feet, you're not going to carry on. You're just going to give up on the approach because this is what most people would do anyway, and most likely recommended, is that if you carry on and you're trying to rush through an ECAM or fix the airplane, you might miss something. So it's not the time to be faffing around with that. So you'll go around and go and think about it. But above 1,000 feet, maybe you've got time. Maybe you can finish the ECAM, set up the airplane for another sort of approach and land. So what I mean by that is, let's say the RVRs were 300 meters in Portugal today, in Lisbon. So 300 meters RVR. That means we could actually fly a Cat 2 approach. Now, we'd probably set up for a Cat 3B anyway, because why not have the best and most restrictive one where we don't actually need to see the runway in? But if we're flying the approach, early on in the approach, something breaks, the airplane tells us, oh, sorry, I can only do a Cat 2 now. We could look at this, or we know that we can actually, okay, fine, Cat 2 is an option. Let's adjust the minima, rebrief, and then carry on the approach using this new, slightly raised minima. That is pretty advanced stuff, though. So anyway, I will now move on to what we're actually going to do. So I've got tutorials out there about how to fly an ILS and land the Airbus A320 in several different versions, including the fly-by-wire, the towless, and the Phoenix. So this is going to follow on from that, but so I do recommend watching those in advance just because it will help you. But even so, we should be able to follow through with this one today. So what configuration can we land in? Well, today I'm sitting in an A320 CEO aircraft, so not the Neo, the CEO. So for this aircraft, I can auto land flap full or flap 3. In either of those situations, there are crosswind limits. They're more restrictive than landing manually. If you see a really windy day and you get those great videos of pilots struggling in the wind, or not struggling, but flying around in the wind, then that will be a manual landing. The aircraft is not allowed to auto land in those situations. You don't tend to get fog on the really windy days, hence that's not an issue, because the wind tends to blow away the fog and churn up the air enough. So we can land flap full or flap 3 with a headwind of 30 knots, a crosswind of 20 knots, tailwind of 10 knots. 30, 20, 10. That's the easy way to remember it. That applies to the CEO with wingtip fences, which is what we've got today. That is those little mini sort of sharklets that you've got out here. Not sharklets, sorry, the mini little fences they're called, wingtip fence. If you have the sharklet, the big winglet style thing, the sharklet, then it's still 30 knots headwind, 20 knot crosswind, 10 knot tailwind. But what it means is the airplane isn't allowed to roll out on its own, only up to 15 knots. So in that case, you'd have to disconnect the autopilot for the rollout, but you can still auto land in 20 knots. That's something we'll talk about a bit later. Neos have slightly different requirements, and there are also different limitations for one engine and operative auto lands. So if you're in a Neo aircraft, then it will be 30 knots headwind, 20 knots crosswind, 10 knot tailwind. But that does vary. The A321 Neo is slightly different, slightly more limiting, and single engine is also more limiting. But I don't want to go too far into all the numbers. But yeah, it's important that you get a sensible idea about whether you can do it. So 40 knots across? No, not going to happen. So let's set up the aircraft for the approach. As usual, in the MCDU, you're going to go in and cover the HAT sort of flow. So you go flight plan, RadNav, progress, perf, fuel prediction, secondary flight plan. So if you follow the mouse along, we're going to go like this. It looks like a little hat. So starting with flight plan, have you set up the right approach? Today, I've got the ILS-02 via PESX. As you can see, that is the hold we're in at PESX, just here. If we go to our chart, we are holding over PESX here, and then we're going to fly straight from this down the approach. Very common to hold on days like this. Obviously, there are arrivals where you could get held on the arrival, not just at the start of the ILS. But anyway, that's what we're doing today. So that's all set up and ready to go. Next, RadNav, very important. Do we have the correct ILS tuned? So let's check. I need to see an ILS of India Lima India, 025 degrees, frequency 109.1. 109.1, 024, 1 degree out, no problem, 3 degrees on the slope, India, Lima, India. So that has all worked correctly. That looks good. Progress page, I'm going to just do my usual Lima, Papa, Papa, Tango, 02 and put that in there. That's just to give me an extra distance to the threshold so I have a better idea. Not required. If we go to performance then, we're going to go to the approach phase and put in the weather. So it's QNH 1007, temperature 11 degrees Celsius, basically calm winds. And that's something else to note. A lot of airports will only have low visibility capability on one runway, so they rely on it being relatively light winds when you do it. For example, in Lisbon, we can only do this onto 02 down to Cat 3B, but not a problem. It's a huge runway at, is it written on here? Did it write on here? Anyway, it's a long runway, and we can expect relatively light winds if it's going to be foggy. So that's all in like normal. We're doing a flap full approach. I typically, most people auto land flap full. You can do it flap 3, but why? I mean, whatever you prefer. But here we go. We need to put in the minima. Now, crucially, if you're going below category 1, then we're going to put it into the radio instead of the barrow. This is sort of standard procedure. What is the difference? Well, barrow means that when you put in the minima, like in a Cat 1 approach, and as we have our Cat 1 chart here, let's have a look at it. So this is not low visibility procedure, so it's 530 is the decision altitude. So that would go into barrow because it's based on the barometric altitude, which is just our altimeter here. But that's not precise enough for flying down to the low altitudes we're going to be flying to for this approach. So we need to use the radio altimeter. So as you can see here, it's actually written in for Cat 3A at 50 rad out, DH50. Decision height is a height, not an altitude. Altitude is above sea level. Height is above the ground beneath you. So these will be measured taking into account any obstacles or buildings. There shouldn't really be an obstacle down 50 feet above the runway. That's basically over the threshold anyway. So if we were doing a Cat 3 single, we would put the radio 50. If we were doing a Cat 2, then I'd put a radio of 100, and you literally just type in 100. But there is a magical thing about doing a Cat 3B, which is we don't actually need to see the runway. There is no decision height. So if you're doing Cat 3A and you get to 50 feet and you don't see anything, you have to go around. Same for the Cat 2. If you get to 100 feet and you don't see anything, you have to go around. There are some requirements to what you have to be able to see in each of these. It does vary between the two, but for a Cat 3B, as long as the RVR, that runway visual range, was 75 meters, then we can carry on without seeing anything. So what do we do then? I don't need a radio height, so I'm going to put in no DH, and then that's going to eventually appear up there. Good. Next, you're going to put the go around altitude in the engine out acceleration. You're going to brief your go around very carefully. It's nice and simple. Straight ahead to 7,000 or flight level 70, then contact approach. So let's put in 7,000. That's just a case of an engine failure on approach. Good. So we've done flight plan, radnav, progress, perf. Now fuel prediction. We have 3.3 tons extra. We've got loads of fuel. Taking into account our alternate, let's just give ourselves 2 tons to go to alternate. It's worth remembering that you need to be careful with your alternates because, of course, if they're the only airfield in the area that have not got fog, and you need to keep a close eye on that weather whilst you're sitting in the hold, then a lot of people will be using it. So let's say Lisbon, or let's say the airfield you're trying to get into is close to its minimums and people can't even make the approach because, of course, we're flying Cat 3B today, which is very good, but there are airfields that are only Cat 2 or even Cat 1. So if you're sitting in the hold waiting to fly into one of those and your alternate is nearby and it's got nicer weather, you need to make sure that you've got enough fuel if you go there to join the queue there, because of course if people can't get into the destination like you and they will want to divert, then if everyone arrives with not much fuel into the alternate, then you could get yourself a bit unstuck. So you need to have extra fuel in case everybody has the same plan as you, basically. Anyway, there we go. We've got over half an hour sitting here in the hold. No problem at the moment. We've got an expected approach time of 5 minutes from now, so that's great. Secondary flight plan, I'm going to copy the active over into there. Yeah, it's pretty not particularly required in this case. Good. Before we begin the approach then, we've already discussed our qualifications, the aircraft state. We're also going to do something slightly unusual. We're going to turn on the LS buttons, and then we're going to press the Autoland light here, and it's going to flash. And it's going to flash these on the display and flash in front of us. So what is this light doing? This is the Autoland light that if this flashes, you have to go around. It means there's been a failure that the aircraft is not happy it can continue to land with. So if that flashes, you're going around. That's the end of it. That's another thing I need to point out, which is if you're on approach and we get if we say below 1,000 feet is a typical place to put this, and then we get an engine failure, then, or any sort of failure, a ding from the aircraft, then we'll just go around and we'll go and solve it safely away from the ground. There's no point continuing and not realizing that you've downgraded or the airplane is no longer safe to auto land or needs something different set up, so you'll just go around. This will also be true if you get flashing. So let's say the localizer deviates suddenly and goes off to one side, then you'll have to go around, though that will probably generate an auto land light anyway. You've also got to consider a downgrade. So do you remember that triple click noise the Airbus gives, where if it reverts to a different mode without being commanded, it goes click, click, click. If you hear that, that's a go around as well, because of course that means that it's potentially downgraded from what you need. So all of those things, if they happen late on in the approach, we're going around. Basically for anything unusual, it's rare to continue. We're going to be using 2 autopilots for the approach like normal. So when we join the ILS, I'm going to arm the approach and engage both autopilots. That way, when we look at our flight mode enunciator up here, it's going to say Cat 3 dual. That's very important because that means it can fly down to Cat 3B minima. If it said Cat 3 single, it means there's been a failure, or we've only engaged one autopilot, and it would say Cat 3 single for just one autopilot. The reason it needs both autopilots to say Cat 3 dual is that it needs to be fail operational. That means if there's a failure, the aircraft needs to be able to carry on and auto land and monitor itself even with that failure. So by having 2 autopilots, that applies. Very complicated terminology. Yeah, let's move on. We're then going to fly down the ILS totally like normal, although probably configure the aircraft a bit earlier than usual. We're going to pay particular attention to our QNH and altimeter settings to make sure we are in the right place, because we will get no visual cues off the ground. Outside the window, we're going to see probably blue clear skies right up until the last sort of 2,000 feet maybe, and then you're going to enter this sort of soup. And that is normal, but that's very disorientating. It's easy to think you're further away from the runway than you are, because normally we fly through the clouds early on in the approach, 10 miles away, say. In this case, we're going to be flying through it right up to the last second of touchdown. As we fly down the approach, monitoring everything, making sure both autopilots are in, we want to make sure we're fully stabilized at 1,000 feet, which means fully configured, gear down, flaps at full. We're going to make sure we're at the approach speed and we are on the ILS as we want to be. Then we're going to watch the modes of the flight mode enunciators up here. This is incredibly important. We are making sure we have certain modes engaged to prove that the aircraft is ready to auto land. As we pass through 400 feet to 350 feet on the radio altimeter, the little green numbers that appear down here, and don't worry, I'm going to talk through all of this as we fly it. As we pass through 400 feet to 350, we want to see land appear in green, and it will block out outer nav. It will just say, or lock and glide slope, and it will just go to land. So that mode must engage by 350 rad out. If it doesn't, we go around. That means the aircraft is ready to land itself. We're then going to continue down the approach. And the next thing is by 30 feet on the radio altimeter, so this is very late now, we need it to say flare. If it doesn't say flare, we're going to go around. And finally, once the main wheels touch down, we're going to make sure that this says rollout, but it needs to do that by the time the nose wheel touches down. If it doesn't, just disconnect the autopilot and roll out yourself. Could be quite challenging in thick soup though. Okay, what else are we going to do different? Well, we're going to leave the autopilots in obviously the whole time, so we're going to let them fly all of that. We're just making sure those modes change as I've just discussed, and we've already discussed if they don't do that, or they do something different, or we get failures or downgrades, we're going around. What is worth noting is in a normal landing we'll close the thrust levers at some point before the touchdown after we've initiated the flare. So you initiate the flare, and at some point before touchdown you'll close the thrust levers, somewhere around 30 feet, 20 feet, maybe a bit later. It all depends on the conditions. On an auto land, the aircraft will close the thrust on itself. It will actually command thrust idle in the flare. Then at 10 feet on the radio altimeter, it's going to tell you retard, which means retard the thrust levers back to idle. So it's an instruction. We don't judge it ourselves. When the aircraft tells us to, which will be at 10 feet rad out, that's when we close them. Because remember, the aircraft will have already reduced the thrust on its own, something it does not do on a normal landing. We're going to monitor for all the usual things, so spoilers, reverse green. We're going to check that the rollout mode's engaged, of course, and make sure what we can see, if we can see anything, is looking sensible out the window, i.e. we are rolling out. If we were doing a Cat 3A or a Cat 2 approach, we would still have done all of the same things as above, but we would need to have seen something at 50 feet. The airplane would have said minimums, and we would need to have seen an appropriate visual reference, and otherwise carry on as normal. Once the aircraft is slowed right down, you can disconnect the autopilot. Very important you do. If you don't and you turn off the runway, when you let go of the tiller, the autopilot will actually try and drag itself back over to the localizer using the rudder. It's, very embarrassing. The aircraft is capable of decrabbing, so in a crosswind you don't need to touch the rudder. It will maneuver the nose into the right position during the flare. I've seen this in real life. It's amazing. It works. It's just great. Very strange feeling, but it's very impressive. I'm going to use low water brake for this landing. It's a nice long runway, but I want a nice gentle rollout. We're going to land flat 4 as we said. I think it's time we head down and begin our approach. So here we are then, ready to, we're just leveling off at 4,000 feet. We're going to go around the hold once more and then leave at pairs X, so that's fine. Something that's worth noting if you want to try this in Microsoft Flight Simulator is how do you get the weather like this? So I've actually got the SoFly weather pack, which gives me 0 visibility. But as you can see, what you need to do is get your cloud layer, get it right down to the, basically to the floor to make sure that the altitude bottom is 0, i.e. Right down at the sea level or wherever, and then you can set the top to whatever you want. I've got it set to about 1800. The airfield is about 300 feet elevation, so that's still 1,000 foot of cloud coverage, as I said, quite typical in these situations. And then you're going to turn the density, let's turn it up a bit more actually, and I'm going to have it overcast 100%, scatter just completely blocked in, and that should give you something usable. So you have to play around with those settings to get this effect. If you add more precipitation, it tends to help as well. Good, so what I'm going to do is go to click immediate exit from the hold. I'm going to press that once, and I'm going to hope that the aircraft will now make its way around the hold and leave. It should tell us that, and then it should come up with the option to resume hold. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but no worries. What I'm going to do then is set up for the approach myself. You could just do immediate exit. So let's slow down the aircraft. Let's go to flap 1. Let's make sure we approach phase is activated, which it is. So we're going to go to flap 1. Again, nice and early. Your status page will appear if you have anything written on it, but as you can see, cabin temperature by pack only does not affect our landing capability. And we can let the aircraft decelerate. Autolanding overweight is not always available to you. Often it isn't. So yeah, good to make sure you're all normally set up. So there we go. We've gone to flap 1. Coming around the approach then. 17 miles out in the Lima, India. Not sure why it won't let us exit the hold. Normally that would just work, but what I'm going to do is just inset the RS, sort of like you would normally. So we'll put it onto a heading of north, which would take us onto an intercept. Got the localizer available, so if we're clear of the localizer, we would do that. You get lock blue. You can't arm the second order pilot until you push the approach button in the real aircraft. So that shouldn't have happened, but there you go. So that's normally what you get, just lock, and it's once you press approach. Anyway, it's gone into lock star, so now I can arm approach, and there we go. A bit messy that, but all we're just doing is intercepting the RLS, just like you have seen in the other videos. But crucially, make sure once you've pressed approach, you press the other autopilot, and there we go. Glide slope is blue and armed, Cat 3 dual, AP1 plus 2, and we've got no DH written there, no decision height, as we don't need one for today. So this is all looking very relaxed. From 4,000 feet, we can expect to intercept the RLS at 11.3 DME. We're at 14.7. Again, you don't want to rush an approach like this. You want it to work out very nicely for you. I'm actually going, well, let's see what happens. Let's see how it sequences. But anyway, holding's a whole other topic. As you can see, still nicely above the clouds. Passengers will have a lovely view out the window. And at this point, they often think, well, oh yeah, I should have mentioned, you might get told, depending on the airline's procedures at this point, that you need to turn off your personal electronic devices, and they're talking about phones and iPads and things. Often you're allowed to continue using them on approach, but these days anyway. Let's just go to flap 2 before we start down the glide slope. So speed is good, flaps to 2. Yeah, often you're allowed to use them, but in low visibility you may not be. It depends on the procedures of the airline, but what it's doing is just making sure there's minimal chance of electronic interference with the aircraft systems. They're very robust, but this is not the time to test anything new. So unless they can absolutely prove it, there is no way for it to interfere. They will not want it to be a risk. So 7,000 feet for the go-around is in. So in speed, glide slope, star, admittedly, localizer, Cat 3 dual, AP1 plus 2, all looking good so far. So remember, monitoring. We're 11 miles out, so I'm just going to fly down the approach like this, nice and simple. You could be a little bit faster than this, I suppose, and then we'll configure and get ready for the landing. Okay, so let's configure the aircraft, gear down, arm the ground spoilers, check, very careful check that 2,500 feet is at the right place. So 2,700 feet, we know the airfield's a little bit raised, that makes sense, although it would actually probably even out over the water and then come back in again. But sensible. Nose lights on. Now here's a question. Do you want the landing lights on? It might be a case if you were looking for anything that you might not want them on, because they will actually reflect light in that cloud. So if you're landing and you need a visual reference, you'd probably quite likely leave them off so you can see the runway lights more clearly as you come out of the murk. But for a no DH, really doesn't matter too much, does it? Let's go to flaps 3 and then to flaps 4. Oh, sign should have been on. Whoops, you definitely want that ready in advance. Good. So landing is, the aircraft is now set up for landing. We've stabilized the approach, nice and in advance, and there we go. So what's happening next? Well, we need to, as I said, wait for the 350 rad out is the latest at which I want to see land on the FMAs. So 350 rad out is what I'm looking for. Otherwise, it's a case of monitoring. As you can see, we are actually only 5 miles away, but still above the cloud, and this is something that can be a bit disorientating. Also, notice any slight slope in the clouds, and you can get confused as to how your aircraft is set up, whether you're tilting or turning or anything like that. Very deceptive. There we go, 1800 feet. That's a beautiful effect, just like it is. Very nice. Just starting to skim into the clouds, and then we'll suddenly get swallowed up by it. Very cool. Not the time to enjoy the beauty. There we go, we've sunk in. And that's us until landing now. Not going to see the ground, not going to see anything, so we need to be very sure that this is all correct. It's very much like suddenly flying in a simulator. You just don't know what's out there. It's a very surreal experience. So as I said, 1,000 feet above the runway, we want to be stable. We're fully configured. We've got all the correct modes. The aircraft's in good shape, and the RVRs were still above what we needed, so we are allowed to continue this approach. Any problems from now on, we're going to go around. We're not going to start fiddling, trying to readjust things. This all happens quite quickly, as you can see. Still just sat in the clouds. Oh, shouldn't be able to see anything yet. Ignore that. I thought I had it set up. Probably need to actually increase the density a bit. Maybe my low top altitude has not worked. So let's just increase that. There we go. Yeah, you need thicker. Right, looking in here then. Focus, focus, focus. That's what it's all about now. Monitoring, monitoring, monitoring. So here we go. By 350 on this number down here, we must see land as the FMA. Now it's bouncing around because of the rain in Lisbon, as we saw that it goes up and down before. Don't get distracted. There we go. Below 400 feet, but before 350, it goes to land as the FMA. Absolutely spot on. We're now very close to the runway, just 200 feet. On a normal approach, you'd be very much have to be visual by now for a Cat 1. I'm going to show you outside so you can see you can't see anything. So next, we're looking for flare by 30 feet, and then we're closing the thrust levers when it tells us to. So I'm just going to set the camera there. Hopefully this all looks...
50, 40,
flare.
20, 10, retard.
Idle. There's touchdown. Reverse like normal. Spoilers. Reverse green. Decel. You can use idle reverse. Using max reverse is a bit more restrictive. Autopilot still engaged, and you can see it tracking that center line. It can do that because the localizer is actually at the other end of the runway. So it's just following the localizer beam like normal. As we get to 70 knots, make sure we are at reverse idle. And there it is. Autolands are not always the smoothest, but sometimes they're absolutely beautiful. It does depend. The aircraft does a fantastic job, and it's an amazing piece of design. Let's take over now with manual brakes. I'm going to take this exit here. You can only use certain exits. As you can see, if I put the rudder... Oh, there you go. It automatically disconnects. So in the real aircraft, if you use the tiller... Oh, make sure we get over to that 10th line. If you use the tiller, it won't disconnect the autopilot because you aren't overriding it. So what you have to do is make sure you... there we go. Got it under control a little bit. Yeah, what you have to do is make sure you do disconnect it before you start that turn. As you can see, things can go wrong quickly. You don't have much time before you go off the side of taxiways and so on. It could be slippery conditions as we have here today. But there we go. Welcome to Lisbon. So that's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. As I said, this has been a frequently requested video for a long time now, probably since I started the channel. So good fun to dive into it. As I said, a very complicated topic. I'm sure I've missed things, so I can only apologize for that. But there are lots and lots and lots of aspects to flying an aircraft in low visibility procedures. For example, where we are parked here is not good enough. We have to actually get past this Cat 2 line if we're going to be in low visibility procedures. There's different callouts you might make to air traffic, all sorts. But it's an amazing feat of engineering. It's fantastic that this is something we can do every day, that you can get up and fly around in thick fog is a testament to the amazing engineering and design of the procedures. So that's all. We'll be seeing you again in another video or live stream very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.